I'm sure y'all are familiar with the stereotype that Appalachia is home to a bunch of reclusive, inbred mountain people. Most Appalachians find this offensive, and for good reason. Most of us are not inbred. Most of us have never met or even seen someone like that. But I have. I live right down the road from one such family. The Mundys. For over 100 years, the Mundy families lived at the house at the end of the road, each generation more inbred than the last. I don't want y'all to picture their home as some old, dilapidated Victorian manor that sits like a stain in a subdivision. This ain't like the Burbs or Edward Scissorhands. Make no mistake, the road I live on is unpaved and long. Manufactured homes and the occasional cabins sit on large lots spread up the mountain. These are lower to middle lower class families. There are a few retirees with new pickups, but overall there ain't much money around here. My home sits about halfway up the road. On a fall day when the trees are bare, I can look up the mountain and see part of the Mundy's house. Now, I said not to picture it as an old, dilapidated Victorian manor, because it's not, but it is old and dilapidated. It's larger than the rest of the homes on the road, but it's box-shaped. A Civil War-era build. The paint is faded, the roof is in disrepair, there's junk spread across the property, windows are broken and covered by plywood. It's seen better days, that's for sure. Actually, as the story goes, the Mundys were somewhat normal back in the day. The home was built in the 1800s by a Confederate veteran. He was married to his cousin, which, I agree, ain't normal, but back then it wasn't that frowned upon. Plus, I think they were second or third cousins, something like that. Anyways, Mr. Mundy started a local general store. It proved to be pretty popular, and Mundy became a successful businessman and a major fixture in the community. He even dabbled in local politics. Mundy and his wife had 8 children, which was a typical amount back then. 5 boys and 3 girls. A couple of the boys died young of illness, and one of the daughters was murdered by a jealous lover, whom the remaining brothers dealt with violently and with finality. Of the 5 remaining children, Levi was the golden child. He worked the general store and had interest in politics like his father. However, unbeknownst to the parents, Levi and his sister Sarah were romantically involved. Mama Mundy died early of what was most likely cancer. And old man Mundy subsequently fell into a deep depression. He took to the bottle pretty hard. One night he was on a drunken hike and died after tumbling down the mountain. Levi, being the favorite, inherited the store. And now that the parents were no longer around to disapprove, he married his sister. Now, back then you could marry a cousin, and most people wouldn't mind. But marrying your sister? Well, that shit's always been abhorrent. Levi and Sarah were too in love to feel shame or embarrassment any longer. So they put their relationship out in the open for everyone to see, and that made folks pretty uncomfortable. So the locals stopped shopping at the Mundy's general store. As you can guess, no customers meant no money, so the store closed down. You might be wondering what happened to the other Mundys. Surely they weren't okay with their siblings marrying each other, bankrupting the family business, and creating little inbred babies in the house they grew up in, right? Wrong. They knew about Levi and Sarah long before the two married. And get this, they joined in on the indecency. Now I'll spare you the details, but story goes that there were nights that people heard some blood-curdling lovemaking taking place in that house. A real family affair. Sarah gave birth to many children, not all of which survived. And of the 6 that did, they almost certainly were not all Levi's. Although they were all his blood in one way or another. When a family is so intermixed, the individual stories begin to blur. I do not know what happened to Levi and Sarah's siblings. Some stayed at home, others moved away. I can only imagine that there's some other Appalachian road with a Mundy family on it. But all I can tell you about now are the Mundys that live on my own road. And they don't come out much, and when you do see them, it's like a Bigfoot sighting. You want to take a picture to prove they exist, but you also don't want to get too close. They don't drive, so they don't go into town. I don't know what they eat. They don't have electricity or plumbing. They have a well on their property, so I guess that's where they get water. There's 5 of them up there, and one really old lady. I've seen her less than the others, maybe only 3 times in my entire life. I saw her when I was about 9 years old. Us kids used to sneak up the mountains to try and catch a look at the Mundys. Our parents were ignorant of this, of course. One afternoon, we got about 30 feet from the house. The front door was open, so we got a peek inside. There was a long hall that appeared to go from the front of the house to the back, and standing in that hall, hunched over, was the old lady. And she was looking right at us. We immediately ducked down the mountain and ran home. We decided the consequences of disobedience were worth telling our parents about the old lady. Now, they weren't happy, but I'll never forget the concern on my father's face as he looked up the mountain. Like the old lady's presence somehow made the situation more disturbing. The second time I saw her, I was 17. My dog had gotten loose and caught a scent that took him up the mountain. My heart sank when I saw he was going towards the Mundy's house. I reluctantly took chase and found myself on their property. It was evening time. The sun hadn't fully set. Nobody was outside that I could see, and I knew if they were, I would have been in danger. People have wandered on their property before and barely escaped with their lives. The Mundys were extremely hostile to trespassers. I whispered loudly and desperately to my dog, but he was hooked on a scent. He went to the side of the house, weaving around junk that I ain't sure how they obtained. Children's toys, car parts, empty bottles and cans. My dog came to a halt to sniff whatever odor, and I snagged him by the collar, and as I turned to rush him home, there she was. She was sitting in a dirty old chair. It wasn't on a porch or in any spot where it would make sense. She was just sitting in the yard amongst the junk. Now, I'm often respectful, even when it's against my better judgment, so my first instinct was to apologize and tell her I was just retrieving my dog. She did not respond. She simply stared at me. I averted my gaze and promptly fled the property. She looked to be about 90 years old at the time. And aside from her sort of witchy old face, the other thing that struck me were her clothes. They looked like clothes I'd seen in pictures of women from the 1800s. The third time I saw her was a week ago. And to help you understand how weird that is, I'm nearly 30 years old now. So, in other words, I saw a 90-something-year-old over a decade ago, and then last week, I saw her again. Not impossible to live so long, but pretty rare, right? Especially in such poor conditions. It was late at night. I was sitting outside drinking a beer and looking at the stars when I heard the shuffling of feet coming down the dirt road. I sat up, and sure enough, I saw shadowy figures. I could tell right away that these people weren't right. Their gait was awkward, their posture was weird. My heart skipped a beat when I counted 5 of them. It was the Mundys. They walked right past without looking at me. I was too shocked to move. I ain't even seen them come down the mountain before. I watched them continue down the road when I heard some more shuffling from the direction they came. It was the old lady. She had a long, wide dress on. I couldn't see her feet, but I heard them kicking up dirt and rock. She looked almost like she was floating. But here's the part that really gives me chills. As she hobbled in front of me, she stopped. She turned and looked directly at me. Without warning, let out a soul-piercing scream. She wasn't scared, although the scream itself was horrifying. No, this was something different. This was a call. Out of my peripheral, I saw the other Mundys sprinting back up the road. Their run was awkward like their walk, but while their walk was sort of clumsy and slow, their run was quick and powerful. I took off from my door and stumbled inside. I locked the door and grabbed one of my dad's old pistols and shut off the lights. My parents were startled out of bed by this nightmare, and Dad rushed into the living room with another gun drawn. I shushed him and waved him over to the window where I was peeking out the blinds. The old woman had stopped screaming the second I had gone indoors, and now the Mundys stood side by side staring at my home. The only light was from the moon, which was not full, but this was the best look I'd ever gotten of the Mundys. 3 men, 2 women, and the old lady. They were all deformed, some worse than others. They looked like patients you'd find in an insane asylum. They looked like sub-level inmates. Other inmates lived amongst white tile and cotton sheets, but these guys looked like they would have been housed in a wet stone cellar. Too horrifying for anyone to see. My dad gasped when he laid eyes on the family all lined up on the road. "That's the old lady I saw when I was a kid," I told him. I asked him if he had any idea her relation to the younger ones, which, considering how inbred they are, is like asking someone to figure out where a circle ends. What he said still baffles me. Dad looked at me real seriously and said, "That's Sarah." I figured there must be another Sarah. The one that married Levi would be at least 140 years old now. Not Levi's wife. She'd be too old, I argued. But Dad just looked at me. He doesn't say much, but when he does, it's precise and true. My dad ain't one for wasting words. The Mundys eventually turned and headed back down the mountain. I wanted to stay up and watch them return, but they never did. At least not back the way they came. But I've seen them since, up on their property. They must have climbed the back way, which is quite a challenge. It's steep and there ain't any roads. I can't imagine that old lady being capable of accomplishing such a task. I kept thinking back to what Dad told me. My logical mind tells me that there's no way a woman that old exists, let alone would even be capable of walking. And I ain't ever heard an old lady even half that age with the capacity to let out such a scream. But there's something that gets me. Makes me think that she truly is Sarah. The Mundys look inbred. Their faces and bodies are contorted, but the old lady is not. At least not beyond what you'd expect from aging. From what I understand, Sarah and her siblings weren't strange looking. Their parents weren't closely related enough to muddy up the gene pool. There ain't any records on these folks. They stop after Levi, Sarah, and their siblings. However, nobody ever found any death certificates for that bunch either, which ain't a surprise, considering the Mundys are as reclusive as they come. They're born on the mountain, and they die on the mountain. They sure as shit ain't sharing family events with anybody outside of that immediate household. And if you're wondering why social services or some other government agency hasn't stepped in, well, that's a mystery as well. Perhaps it's because there's just no record of them existing, and until recently, nobody saw them outside their property. We'd all just stay away from the end of the road and pretend they didn't exist. Live and let live, I guess. However, what I discovered this morning has made me reconsider that saying. First thing I do when I wake up each morning is get out of bed and open my blinds to let the sunlight in. Upon opening them, red light flooded my room. My eyes hadn't fully woken up, so my initial thought was that there was a wildfire. I stepped outside to look and found that it was a clear day, blue sky and all. So I knew then that it was the window itself that was red. As I got closer, that's when I saw the coagulation in bits of what appeared to be hair or fur. The entire window had been smeared with blood. My family is fine, don't worry. The police came out and took a report. They were pretty apprehensive about questioning the Mundys. Told me that the Mundys don't mess with no one. They even argued with me and said it was most likely someone I knew playing a prank. One officer even accused me of doing it myself. Fuck them. I need answers. I need to know who the old lady is. And why ain't there any young kids? I find it hard to believe that this generation of mutants is the one to break tradition. Maybe I'll find something that'll convince somebody to end that nightmare and move the Mundys to some place that ain't here. I'm going in that house. Well, I did it. I went into the Mundys' house. I figured the exterior was a good indication of what was to be expected inside. But what I discovered is so much worse than I could have imagined. I told y'all how they came down the mountain late at night. Well, they did it again. 1 a.m. seems to be their preferred time to do whatever it is they're doing. So I sat in the dark peeking out the blinds and watched the 5 younger Mundys walk past the house. And then trailing about 20 feet behind them was the old lady. She didn't stop and scream this time. She just hobbled past without even looking in my direction. I waited for them to get a ways down the road, and then I grabbed my pistol, put on my headlamp, and headed towards their house. Nighttime on the mountain is dark. There ain't any light pollution out here, so there's an added creepiness to the Mundys' house at night. People not from around here might look at the dark, decaying old house and assume it was long abandoned. But the reality is that it's been occupied longer than any other house on the mountain. Once on the property, I turned on my headlamp to cross the yard without tripping over the junk. As I said before, there's heaps of stuff thrown around here that doesn't make sense. Car parts but no car. Kids' toys but no kids. Maybe they're stealing this stuff during their late night excursions. I made it to the front door, which was easy enough to get through, considering it hadn't been locked. Apparently, they ain't worried about intruders. As I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It's by far the worst odor I've ever had the displeasure of inhaling. The second thing I noticed was the buzzing of flies. Lots of them. At that moment, I was confident I'd be finding a dead body. I plugged my nose and took another step forward. I was in that hall I'd seen the old lady standing so many years ago. At one point it was wallpapered, much of which has been peeled away over time. What remains is stained and dirty. The walls have holes in them. You can see into other rooms through these holes. And I could also tell that the wood was old as the house itself. There'd obviously been no history of remodeling. With each step I thought I would break through the floor, but by some miracle it stayed strong. I entered a room to the left. By my understanding of typical house layouts, I'd say the room was at one point either a den or a dining room, but now it appeared to be a place that they slept and urinated. That's right. They do it in the same room, both directly on the floor. Although, maybe the filthy pillows are used for something other than sleeping. I guess that's just wishful thinking on my part. The buzzing of the flies grew louder as I headed further towards the back of the house. I entered the kitchen and it became a roar. The room was host to more flies than I'd ever seen. The source of the smell was in there as well, and my stomach couldn't handle it. I tried my best to get outside, but I couldn't make it in time. I vomited in the hallway. Panic set in. They were going to see the vomit and know someone was in there, and after the incident the other night, and then the blood on the window, I figured I'd be suspect number one. They don't have much for towels, maybe none at all, so I grabbed one of those dirty pillows. I wiped up my mess, which at the time, I did consider that maybe they wouldn't even notice it. The house was that bad. They don't use pillowcases, so I just returned the pillow to the room and flipped it over so that the puke-soaked side was hidden. Honestly, the vomit ain't detracting much from the current condition of that pillow. I took a breath, plugged my nose, and headed back to the kitchen. I stepped into the swarm of flies. Keeping my eyes open was difficult. Not sure if you've ever come across an odor so foul your eyes burned. But that's what this was. Plus all the flies buzzing around my face. I realized that what the flies were circulating were several plastic buckets sitting on the floor. This was a Civil War era kitchen, by the way. No fridge. Just a wood-burning stove, moldy old cabinets, and buckets. Reluctantly, I stepped towards the buckets. I held my breath and looked inside, and once again, my stomach lurched. Inside were pounds of rotten meat. I couldn't tell from what, and I didn't have it in me to keep looking. I stormed out of the room and somehow managed to fight back the bile. I guess I know what they eat now. The house is 2 stories, and the stairs are in horrible condition. The railing is gone and just about every other step is damaged. But I needed to know what was upstairs. However, as I walked back up the hall, I noticed something. There was a door below the stairs, and it was padlocked. Is it weird that I thought even a padlock would be too complicated for the Mundies? I don't have anything on me to break the lock, and I sure as shit wasn't going to shoot it, so I continued up the stairs. 3 bedrooms. The first one I went into was small and full of children's clothes. Modern clothing. This was, of course, very alarming, as that's all that was in there. Just a massive pile of it. Do they have kids? Are they stealing kids' clothes? Or, worse of all, are they stealing kids? Children do go missing out here occasionally. The second room was a similar size, maybe a bit larger. This room was badly damaged. There was a large hole in the floor, which allowed me to see back downstairs. The walls had some sort of primitive artwork on it, like someone finger painted on them. They didn't use paint though. The color palette seemed limited to the colors that came out of a human body. Handprints, stick figures, shapes, but one thing left me deeply unsettled. There was a series of 4 numbers that I recognized. My address. I moved on to the final room. The door was closed. I turned the knob and went in. This was the largest bedroom, the master. Inside was one of the more shocking discoveries from the night. Aside from some dust, it was clean. And not only that, someone decorated it like an actual bedroom. There was a full-size bed, a stand-up mirror, a chest of drawers, nightstands. However, the furniture was ancient, Civil War era. Sitting on the nightstand was a framed picture, black and white. A man and a woman. It looked to be from the 1800s. They weren't smiling, as is often the case in pictures from that time. They weren't deformed like the Mundys are now, but they did look like siblings, similar face and hair color. I recognized the dress on the woman as the one I'd seen the old lady wearing. It must be Levi and Sarah. The nightstand that the picture had been sitting on was positioned beneath an uncovered window, so I had turned off my headlamp not to draw attention. The light from the moon was sufficient enough. I turned my headlamp back on to snap a picture of the photograph, and when I did, I heard that familiar soul-piercing scream coming from the back of the house. I immediately shut off my light and looked out the window, and there they were. They were hurtling themselves up the steep incline of the mountain like animals. The old lady was clinging to the back of one of the men, and she was staring right at me. I dropped the picture and ran. I lunged down the stairs as quickly as possible and out the house. I didn't turn back. I sprinted home, ran inside, and locked the door. The gun hasn't left my side. I was happy to see the sunlight this morning and that the Mundys didn't come down the mountain after me, but I didn't get a lick of sleep. I can't call the police. There's nothing to report aside from my own trespassing. My address is written on their wall in blood. Just the numbers, but that's enough to freak me out. And what's up with the children's clothes? My gut tells me I should take my parents and leave town for a bit. But I think I'm close to finding out something big. I need to know what's in that padlocked room. And where do the Mundys go at night? Sometimes you have to wonder who the more powerful being is, God or Satan. Up here in Appalachia, there's a church just about every few miles. The folks inside would tell you that by believing in Christ and letting go of your earthly desires, you may one day enter the kingdom of heaven, the paradise ruled by the Lord himself. But why is it that earthly desires are seen as something we should ignore? After all, we do live on Earth, don't we? So what's wrong with living in accordance with the only place we know? Maybe Earth is ruled by the devil. A fella that lives right in the eyes of the Lord might be comforted by the promise of everlasting life in heaven. But what of those who live according to the will of Satan? What are they promised? I do not have the answers to these questions. However, what I discovered last night has left me sure that there are people on this mountain who do. The Mundys once again came down the road an hour past midnight. I watched out the window as they passed my house without incident. 3 men, 2 women, and the old lady. My goal for the night was to follow them and find out what exactly it is that they've been doing. Gun clipped to my waist, I set out into the night behind them. I stayed back a great way not to take any chances of spooking them. For this reason, I brought some binoculars with me as well. The Mundys walked like a group possessed. There was no chatting, no pointing, no looking up at the stars or for the hooting owls, no concern about bears or the rustling noises the woods make at night. They just kept walking. And then towards the end of the road where the ground begins to level out, they stepped into the woods. I was about 100 yards behind them. The way I saw it, My options were either to give up and go home or hasten my pace a bit and follow them into the woods. I chose the latter. Going into Appalachian woods at night can be risky for many reasons. Dangerous wildlife is an obvious one, but I bet y'all ain't too familiar with shiners. Hillbillies hiding amongst the trees, producing illegal moonshine. Them fellas get real paranoid sometimes. I stepped to the forest line and listened for the crunch of leaves. I could hear the Mondays moving, but the forest was too thick to see through. They don't use any flashlights or lanterns, so any shadows they cross through keeps them hidden. I decided to step into the woods and follow the noise. I had to walk as slowly and carefully as possible. Otherwise, I couldn't hear them over my movement. After several minutes of sneaking through the woods, my heart jumped as a commotion stirred directly in front of me. The rustling of leaves was followed by a quick patter away. A rabbit. I relaxed at the realization and then immediately tensed back up when I noticed that the Mondays had stopped moving. I held my breath and knelt. My heart was racing. Somebody moved. Slowly, as if sneaking up on prey. I unholstered my pistol and unlocked the safety. There was movement in front of me, but as I leaned forward to get a better look at what appeared to be a human figure, there was a sudden motion to my left. Then immediately following that, more movement, but this time to my right. I slowly backed up, but then I stopped dead in my tracks. Someone was lurking behind me. I was surrounded. I began to panic. The only thing I felt I could do was run away, gun blazing. I readied myself, and then something strange happened. I heard the movement of a group from the same spot the Mondays had been before the rabbit incident. They were moving away from me. So, who had me surrounded? I waited a moment for any indication that I was still surrounded, but heard nothing except the fading footsteps of the Mondays. Could it have been my imagination? I could see that the woods opened up to a road ahead. The moonlight revealed that the trees no longer obscured the Mondays. I stayed back and watched as they crossed the road and headed down a long driveway towards a dark, single-story house. I sat back at the forest line and lifted the binoculars to my eyes. I recognized the house as the one the Keller family lives in. They're a friendly couple with 3 young kids. I see them in town now and then in the occasional barbecue. I couldn't stand the thought of something happening to them and their boys. I almost fired off a shot as a warning, but then I saw Mr. and Mrs. Keller standing on their porch, waiting for the Mondays. The image of the 2 families standing together was baffling at first. They were polar opposites. But as the Mondays stepped to them, the Kellers fell to their knees and bowed, as if they were worshipping those inbreds. The old lady stepped to the front of the pack while the Kellers remained bowing. She must have said something because they both sat up simultaneously to look at her. Then the old lady motioned towards the house, and the 5 younger Mondays entered. The old lady and the Kellers remained outside. Suddenly, the Keller children began screaming. They were crying, begging. Out the front door came the Mondays, dragging the terrified children. The children spotted their parents and pleaded for them to help. The parents did nothing but fall to their knees again and bow to the old lady. The 3 male Mondays gripped the children, carried them like luggage. The kids kicked and flailed. One even appeared to bite the leg of his captor, all to no effect. I'd seen enough. I stood and fired a series of shots into the air, Let them go, I yelled. The Mundys stopped and looked at me, and then once again, the old lady let out the familiar soul-piercing scream. The male Mundys dropped the children and charged me, but the female scooped the Keller boys right back up. Through my peripheral, I saw one of the women sprinting away at what I can best describe as an Olympian speed while holding 2 children, the second sister not far behind with the other child. These were not babies they were holding. These were grade school children, and the women were running as if them boys weighed nothing. I could hear the fading echo of the bellowing children as they were carried off into the night. The Mundy brothers were nearly on me as I fired shot after shot. The moment was too chaotic for me to point and aim. I couldn't tell if I was hitting them, as I was both running away and shooting simultaneously. Then, as if sent by God himself, headlights appeared around the bend. They illuminated the Mundys, who promptly scattered and disappeared into the woods. I listened as the crunch of leaves grew more distant beneath their rapidly moving feet. The vehicle stopped, and I took a moment to look towards the Keller house. The old lady was gone, but the Keller couple remained. They just stood there watching me. The door of the stopped vehicle flew open. "Get in!" yelled the driver. I recognized his voice. It was my dad. I jumped into his truck and immediately began telling him that the Mundys had kidnapped the Keller boys and that we needed to call the police. He sped off towards home, not stopping to give the Kellers an ounce of acknowledgement. Dad's hands were tight around the steering wheel. Without looking at me, he spoke. "It's time you know the truth about the Mundys." What follows is my best recollection of the conversation my father and I had upon arriving back home. There won't be many misquotes, as most of what was said is burned into my memory. Speaking low as not to wake Mom, Dad began. "This mountain belongs to the Mundys." "What are you talking about?" "It's their mountain. Always has been. They've only been here since the 1800s. "That ain't true." "Old Man Mundy? The Confederate soldier? You telling me he wasn't real?" "Oh, he was real all right. Him and his wife both." "Then what do you mean they always been here?" "He wasn't the first Mundy. He was just the one they decided to let outside." "Outside of where?" "The mountain." "I don't understand." "Son, the Mundys lived inside the mountain. I don't mean on it. I mean in it. Beneath the dirt and rock." "Like in a cave?" "Pretty much." "Are you telling me that Old Man Mundy was the first one to come out of the cave?" "He's the first one they let out." "Why?" "To get a Mundy up top, I suppose. People were moving onto the mountain without any knowledge of what was beneath them." "So, Old Man Mundy was a spy of some sort?" "More like a tax collector." "What do you mean?" "There's a fee to live on the mountain." "What kind of fee?" Dad looked down at the table and swallowed. I could tell his next words weren't going to be easy. "Children." My stomach dropped, and I could feel the blood leaving my face. Now I knew what I'd seen at the Kellers. Payment. I was angry. I raised my tone, something I've never done with my father before, and said, "The fuck they doing with them kids? Dad shrugged. He looked defeated, like he had just confessed to a terrible sin. I only know what happens to some of them. I waited for him to continue. They don't take babies. The Mundys ain't equipped to handle them that young. They like them to be old enough to follow commands. What do they have them doing? I ain't certain. I've never been inside the mountain myself, but I know that sometimes they release the kids back onto the surface. Of course, the kids ain't right when they come out, nor are they kids anymore. Although they ain't quite grown up either. Sure, their bodies have matured, but their minds went backward. Do they go home? Some of them no longer have a home to go to. Sometimes their parents stumble upon them, assuming they recognize who they are. Others just wander. Well, I ain't seen them. Maybe you have, and you just didn't know. They're out there somewhere, usually in the woods. I remembered back to the incident in the woods, where I had been surrounded by an unseen group while following the Mundys. My thought was interrupted by a realization. If the price to stay on the mountain is children, then... Dad, how are we still living on the mountain? He closed his eyes. He looked so much older than I'd ever noticed before. He clenched his hands together to stop from shaking. I leaned forward and asked, Dad, do I have siblings I don't know about? He looked at me, tears in his eyes, and said, No. How are we still here then? I gave them someone else's child. My father broke down. I'd never seen him shed a single tear my whole life until now. It looked as if every tear he'd ever held back was now escaping. My mom had woken up and was standing in the hall. She knew immediately what the conversation was about. We had to do it, she said. We couldn't give up our own child. I turned to her. When did this happen? You were an infant. We paid the fee early. Stop talking like they're currency, damn it. They're children. This child wasn't well off to begin with. What do you mean? My dad wiped his face with his handkerchief and regained his composure. Up north, there's a place that sells children. It's a god-awful place. Those poor kids. I could see he was getting emotional again. Well, he continued, we purchased a boy. Why a boy? I suppose we figured a boy would be better equipped to deal with whatever it was that awaited him. How old was he? 7. Jesus. It was my dad's turn to raise his voice. You think I wanted to do that? You see what it's done to me. I'm sorry, damn it, I'm sorry. I couldn't give up my child, I just couldn't. We sat for a moment in silence. I reckon none of us wanted to continue further into the nightmare, but I needed to know more. The Kellers gave up 3 children. Their own blood, I said. The Kellers will become prominent citizens pretty soon. Why? Different payments reap different rewards. 1 child means you can stay up on the mountain. 2 children allows you to leave. 3 children, and you prosper. Prosper? How? The Mundys are the ultimate authority here. They decide how you live. If you want to live comfortably, you have to give up 3 children. They gave up their own flesh and blood, though. Y'all didn't do that. Why didn't they give the Mundys some strangers' kids? I couldn't believe those words came out of my mouth. Couple of reasons. The reward is greater if it's your own blood. Gives you Mundy protection. If anyone wrongs you, the Mundys will deal with them. What's the other reason? Cage-free eggs. Come again? Raise the kids well before sending them to the slaughterhouse. What the fuck? My dad nodded in agreement. Fuck this, I said as I stood up. Let's just leave. And we can't. Why not? We've been on vacation before. Nothing happened. The Mundys are aligned with forces much larger than us. I'm talking about evil forces, son. Something supernatural. I sat back down and waited for him to continue. Sure, we've been on vacation, but it ain't ever been relaxing. Not for your mom and I. Everywhere we went, there'd be an extra shadow following ours, reminding us of the deal we made. A person? No, son. Something evil. Inhuman. A demon, I guess. Whatever it is. It's there anytime we leave the mountain. This is unreal. It's real. I was overwhelmed with all I'd just heard. I ain't one to buy too heavily into ghost stories. I tend to trust my senses more than I do stories. But I'd seen with my own eyes the unnatural speed and strength of the Mundys. And what about the old lady, living as long as she supposedly has? Is that really Sarah? I asked. It's her, all right. When old man Mundy died, his kids became the collectors. But you see, them kids lusted after one another, and the family tree started to rot. And as a result, the Mundys became abominations we see today. Where are you going with this? And we pay a fee to the Mundys to live on the mountain, but they pay a fee of their own to, I don't know, the devil or something. I don't know what they were promised, but they made some sort of deal. And when old man Mundy's kids chose to muddy up their own gene pool, whatever force they were aligned with must have cursed the last surviving of the siblings to live forever and continue collecting. Sarah was old when her final sibling died, so she remains old for eternity. At least that's how it's been told to me. So, because the inbred children aren't capable of complex thoughts, the devil or whoever cursed the last one who is? Exactly. What about the general store and the politics? The Mundys were already in control. Why even bother? They held up appearances for a bit. Everyone blocks out reality up here and pretends things are different. And I guess that's how they maintain sanity. Maybe that's what old man Mundy was trying to do as well. But his children were less concerned about societal norms. They introduced another deeply disturbing truth to the mountain, and that was too much for people, I guess. It's hard for people to pretend like a bunch of inbreds are normal. I guess that makes sense. But if the Mundys been living underground all them years prior, I can't imagine there'd be much selection for partners. Old man Mundy's kids couldn't have been the first to reproduce with their kin. It ain't just Mundy's been down there. Who else? Don't make me point out the obvious, son. What? They don't just collect boys. Oh. My dad closed his eyes and nodded. And before people started paying them, they just took whatever kids they found. Old man Mundy was likely born from some poor girl that got taken. I can't. We have to do something. Blood on the window was a warning to us. To you? It was on my window. It was a reminder that we're not under their protection. They'll come after us if we don't stay back. You think tonight might have been the tipping point? I don't know. And if it is? I don't know. I sat quietly for a moment. I think I know how to get inside the mountains. My dad's eyes grew large. How? There's a door beneath the stairs. I've felt like a failure much of my adult life. Nearly 30 years old and still living at home. I don't hold jobs long, and when I'm in them, they don't pay anything a lone man can survive on anyways. If you want your own property up here, you best be married. And seeing as how I ain't had a relationship that lasted, that's been out of the question for me. But I see now that I've been blessed. Had I accomplished my dream of independence from my parents, I would have had to do something truly awful to keep it alive. So, I ain't gonna whine about being a failure anymore. I'd gone into town yesterday morning to buy some supplies. This is a small town, and if you go through enough of them, you'll find that they don't always have a police force, but we do. It ain't anything substantial, just a handful of good old boys wearing badges. As I was loading up and getting back in my truck, I noticed Chief Collins approaching me. "How you doing, son?" he asked. I figured it was best he didn't see what I'd just purchased, so I closed the door and stood outside the truck with him. "Not bad, sir," I said. "Good. All quiet up on the mountain?" Now, Chief Collins ain't living at home with his parents like me. He's married with kids and has a decent-sized house. He's definitely given kids to the Mundies, and based on his prominent position in the community, I'm gonna guess he gave them 3. "Actually," I began. "Not really." "Oh?" "Heard quite the fuss coming from the Keller house last night." "Man, the Kellers ain't too close to your place. You heard them from all the way up there?" "Well, the boys were mighty loud. And you know how noise carries out here." "Now, which boys are you talking about?" "The Keller boys. The children." Chief Collins pinched his mustache and gave a shit-eating grin. "And the Kellers don't have any children." It was obvious this fucker was lying, as I knew for a fact he coached them boys in baseball. So, I played along. "You sure? Maybe I'm thinking of somebody else." "Positive. The Kellers ain't ever had any kids." "At least not yet," he laughed. I shrugged. "Well, alright then. I better head back home. Good seeing ya." Chief Collins waved as I pulled away, and in the mirror, I watched as his smile promptly faded. Dad was waiting for me at home. We'd laid all our guns across the kitchen table. 2 Remington 870 shotguns, 2 Ruger hunting rifles, and several different pistols and revolvers. "You got the stuff?" he asked. I set several bags containing ammunition, flares, batteries, zip ties, and more beside the table. Told the fellow working the counter that all the recent UFO news had gotten us worried. Dad chuckled. "You think he believed you?" He agreed that they were cause for concern. Dad loaded another pistol. Your mother called. She said she made it there safe. She see it? He nodded. We told her to head out of town and stay at a church for the night. The idea being that if this supernatural force truly is connected to the devil, she'd be safe in a church that the Mundys don't control. We knew it was a slim chance. She don't want it to deter us, though, Dad said as he loaded another pistol. I stepped over to the table to help load the remaining guns, and Dad placed a hand on my shoulder. Son, he said, many years ago, your mother and I did something we're deeply ashamed of to keep you with us. I don't want to lose you, but if I do, at least it's while doing what is right. Dad slapped the magazine into the pistol and chambered around. And you damn sure won't be going down alone. Or without a fight. Dad placed the last pistol on the table with all the other guns, knives, and tactical gear. There's gonna be a fight? I laughed and hugged him. I told him I loved him. We were going to be entering hell after midnight, and I couldn't think of a better man to do it with. We'd heard it was going to rain through the night and prayed that the Mundys weren't the type to wait out a storm. We were banking on them heading down the mountain at 1 a.m. Otherwise, we'd have to wait another day. And we didn't know if we had that kind of time. Luckily, the rain wasn't overly heavy. Enough to get you wet without feeling like you're swimming. We watched from the window as the Mundys walked past the house. Once they were out of sight, we exited the house armed like a damn backwoods SEAL team. We each carried a shotgun and a rifle, with pistols attached to our waist and extras in our backpacks. We both wore headlamps, which we kept off until reaching the Mundy house. Once on the property, we weaved around the ever-growing junk collection and made it to the front entrance, which was still unlocked. We stepped into the creaking old hallway, the odor of rotting meat just as pungent as before. Water from the strengthening storm dripped from the various cracks in the walls and ceiling. The buzzing of the flies grew louder as we traveled further down the hall. Then, without warning, the rear door at the end of the hall crashed open. A male Mundy charged through without pause. My dad, who had insisted on taking lead out of what he felt was his parental duty, managed to fire off a single shot from his Remington 870 as he was knocked to the floor. I aimed and fired, but I'd also been hit. From behind. My shot went high and into the ceiling. The gun fell from my hands. The second I collided with the ground, I began to be dragged by my ankles back the way we came in. I clawed at the floor, trying not to lose sight of my dad. He was fighting from his back. The Mundy he was struggling with appeared to be bleeding from the shoulder. Not that it made any difference. I watched as the Mundy tossed my dad's shotgun and dragged him by his beard over to the padlocked door. Dad drew his pistol from his waist as I was pulled outside into the mud. Several shots rang out from inside, but not a full clip. The Mundy had stopped him. I pulled my pistol and quickly rolled over to fire. Immediately, my wrists were pinned to the ground above my head. My attacker was mounted on top of me. I was now face to face with a Mundy. He leaned in close. The smell of rancid meat was present as he breathed on me. He seemed to be enjoying it, like a baby playing with a toy, and with a toothless smile to match. And keep holding them up, Bubba, a familiar voice said from nearby. Suddenly, a flashlight shined in my eyes, and I felt someone take my pistol. Then they proceeded to frisk me and remove the rest of my weapons. Boy, you done it now, said Chief Collins, as he angled the light away from my eyes. "Let me go!" Chief Collins laughed. "Now, what you think, Sarah?" The old lady stepped into sight. Her long, thin hair was wet against her old, witchy face. She got real close to me, leaned over, and said, "They're expecting you." Sarah didn't stand over me long. She said what she said and then went into the house. The one called Bubba stood up and grabbed me by my collar, dragging me as he followed her. The sisters trailed behind us, snickering. There was also the third male Mundy, who seemed to be the youngest of the group. He hung back with the girls, looking like he ain't got a single fully functioning brain cell. The Mundys had a childlike demeanor that was anything but cute. The happier they got, the uglier they looked. Behind the sisters and the younger Mundy was Collins, that smug piece of shit. Bubba yanked me over to the door beneath the stairs. The door was open. My dad and the other male Mundy were nowhere in sight. "Let him walk," said Sarah. Bubba let go of me. I stood up and could now see that I was about a foot taller than Sarah. She was thin and hunched over, and her face showed no emotion. "Where's my dad?" I asked. She nodded towards the opening where the padlocked door had previously hung shut. I could see that beyond it was a dimly lit stairwell that spiraled underground. I stepped in. Lantern flames flickered along the walls as I descended the stone stairs. This was not stone like you'd see in a castle. These steps seemed to be carved from the mountain itself. "Knock on the door when you're back up." I turned to see Collins close the door and heard the click of the padlock. It was now just me, Sarah, and Bubba. The sisters and their younger brother stayed upstairs. I continued down the steps. I could hear the distant rattle of chains, the sharpening of blades. "Collins, some kind of servant to you?" I asked Sarah. "He's kin." I coughed out a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. He's ugly, but not Mundy ugly. How'd that happen?" Sarah didn't respond. I figured I wasn't going to get much more than that and continued in silence. As we descended further, the air became damper, like standing next to a group of people that had just finished breaking a sweat. I could hear sharp cries of pain and what sounded like the crack of a whip. I considered that maybe I truly was entering the depths of hell. Finally, the stairs leveled out, and I stepped into a cavern more enormous than I'd ever imagined existed. Spread throughout were old cages like medieval jail cells. In them were hundreds of people, all crowded together. They varied in age, some young, some old. They all looked dirty and tired, but fed. Torches illuminated the cavern. A little ways off, I could see folks walking around. Some wore shackles that rattled as they moved, while others were unrestrained. "Where's my dad?" I asked. Sarah nodded to a nearby cage. It was smaller than the others, and he was in it by himself. He'd taken quite a beating. His left eye was swollen shut, and his hair and beard were caked in blood. I ran over and reached my arms through the bars. I needed to touch him, let him know I wasn't gone. "Dad." He opened his one good eye and looked at me. "I reckon we fucked up. It's starting to look that way. This place, you can feel the evil in it, can't you?" I nodded. I'd done some work in a jail years ago, installing conduit and running wires for a fire system. The guards accompanied us around to the different spots and gave us the background on some inmates. One of them was a serial killer. He'd done some horrendous things to his victims. At one point, I was in his cell with him, fishing wires through the wall for a smoke detector. The guard stood outside to make sure nothing happened, but still, I felt the killer's eyes watching me. I could sense his appetite for human butchery. I felt his evil. I could feel the same thing in the cave. "Son," Dad said as he gripped my hand, "I'm sorry I waited so long to tell you the truth. Every father wants to see his son grow up to be a successful man, but I knew what waited for you if you ever did. Part of me wanted you to be stuck at home forever, so I'd never have to tell you about this nightmare." He gripped my hand tighter and continued, "I know you felt lost and lonely these past few years, and I figured if you ever found a girl you wanted to marry, that'd be the time I'd tell you. But listen to me. Your life on that land is paid for. If you can convince the Mundys to let you return to the surface, you can live there the rest of your days. You'll just have to pretend like everyone else that this shit ain't going on." "I can't do that, Dad. I can't live in the shadow of these monsters." Dad looked at me a moment and then smiled. "You're a stronger man than me." He reached through the bars and pulled me close, and I felt something solid drop into my coat pocket. "Give 'em hell." I backed away from the cage, looking at my father for what may be the last time. "They're waiting," said Sarah. I turned to her. "Who are they?" "You'll see." I noticed that the other Mundy was nearby and hurt pretty badly. Dad put up a good fight. Sarah motioned for me to continue walking. The poor souls looked from their cages as I walked past. Not a word from any of them. I heard a cage door open and watched as a captive was grabbed by two unshackled. He flailed wildly but wasn't strong enough to resist. They forced him onto a nearby stone table, where one of the shackled prisoners was made to strap the captive down with leather restraints. The man lay flat across the table, begging and screaming. Before I had a chance to react to what was happening, he was decapitated. His final scream echoed off the damp cavern walls. The prisoner unstrapped the body of the victim. The other two picked it up and carried it over to a wooden wagon and dropped it on top of a pile of other headless bodies. I was made to continue on. I saw as I passed the stone table that the victim's head was being sliced open on the top. They handed it to the prisoner, who carried it over to one of the cages. He tossed it inside. I didn't look long enough to find out what the prisoners do with them heads. I'd become queasy at the thought of continuing further and finding out what awaited me. But still, I pressed on. But all I could see up ahead was what appeared to be the end of the cavern. A dead end. As I got closer, I could see that up against the wall was another wooden wagon, and inside it were more bodies. But this wagon was only half as full as the other one. Next to the wagon was an opening in the wall. It didn't appear man-made, as it didn't have any consistent angles. It was likely old as the cave itself. It was small and narrow, and I could see a blood trail going through where someone had dragged bodies. I stopped near the entrance and turned to Sarah. I had nothing but hatred for this woman, but at that moment, she felt safer than whatever was on the other side of that wall. "Don't leave them waiting," said Sarah. Every fiber of my body told me to turn around and run, but I wouldn't have been able to outrun Bubba. I've seen the nearly inhuman speed he's capable of. And where would I even run to anyways? I was trapped in this hellish nightmare. So I pressed forward. I figured I would die either way, so I might as well learn who they are. I stepped into the opening and noticed that Sarah wasn't joining me. She waited outside, watching me move further into this other, darker section. The tunnel opened up, and I was in a cavern more massive in height than the other. The ceiling extended upwards hundreds of feet, thousands even. I realized I was standing beneath the highest point of the mountain. That feeling of evil was more pronounced in here, so thick you could almost taste it. There was light about halfway up. It looked to be an enormous fire-lit chandelier of some kind, hanging from the longest chain I'd ever seen. It wasn't fancy in any way and looked to be made out of branches and bones. I'd been so distracted by the size of the cavern, I hadn't realized something was moving ahead of me. The light from the chandelier only barely illuminated the ground below, so it was difficult to see at first. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed that this figure was facing away from me. It was large and dark and huddled over. Something protruded from its back, pointing outwards like spread arms. Then I heard a sound that will forever haunt me. The snapping of bones as limbs were torn from a body. The thing began to feast on a corpse, and I could hear crunching. This creature doesn't bother eating around the bone. Suddenly it stood. I thought this was some animal on all fours at first, but now I could see that it was something different. Something sort of human. This wasn't no ordinary human though. Not in build and certainly not in appetite. What I'd initially thought was black fur was a long, ragged gown. Very long. The creature stood at least 15 feet tall and had very long, thin arms. And its fingers were as long as my own arms. It turned around to face me, and I immediately froze. The thing had long, black patches of thin hair, and white eyes that pierced through the darkness. It was eating a torso. I'd once seen in a book a painting titled Saturn Devouring His Son. The image stuck with me because of how disturbing it is. This reminded me of it. The figure looked feminine. I could see exposed breasts through the torn gown. She tossed the torso aside and continued chewing, staring at me all the while. Once finished, she spoke. "Welcome, child." A chorus of voices of varying tones and volumes, the more prominent one being female, echoed throughout like a cathedral. The sound passed over me like a cold chill and lingered on my skin. Suddenly, hundreds of candles set in pockets along the cavern walls lit up simultaneously. I could now see the horror standing in front of me. She was tall and gangly, with a face like a rotting possum. Not an outwardly extending jaw like you'd see in one of them animals, but a sharp-toothed smile that likely wasn't there out of joy. Her skin was pale as the moon. From her back protruded long bones, like antlers. "Come closer," the voices echoed. I was frozen with terror, unable to move or speak. I don't know what I'd expected, but it wasn't this. "Come closer!" Her voice boomed. Singular. Masculine. "Who are you?" I finally managed to say. She breathed heavily, seemingly frustrated that I'd not yet moved. Then she exhaled. "We are the beginning." The beginning of what? She held out her long arm and motioned with her fingers. "Come closer, and we will show you." I was confident that what followed would be me getting devoured like that body she'd been chewing on earlier. That awful sound of teeth breaking through bone. All I could do was hope I was wrong. I stepped forward. She grinned. "Yes, that's it. Closer." It was now apparent just how tall this abomination was. She towered over me. My head wasn't even to her waist. She leaned down and put her face inches from mine. I could smell the metallic odor of the blood from her previous meal. Her eyes were large white saucers. "Witness us," she said, and all the candles went out simultaneously, plunging the cavern into complete darkness. Now, what comes next might be hard to believe, or maybe it won't be considering all I'd already gone through. I was not told a story by this thing, but instead given memories, knowledge of the past. This is what I learned. In Scandinavia many centuries ago, there were people who practiced witchcraft, both men and women. At first, they were celebrated for their ability to heal others. It didn't take long, though, for these witches and warlocks to develop a taste for more sinister practices. Evil had permeated their souls, and at night, they became entities known as the mare. Their souls would take on a hideous physical form, and they'd wander from person to person, giving them nightmares, hence the name. Sometimes the nightmares were so awful, people died from them. Before long, the Scandinavian people started accusing the witches and warlocks, and rightfully so. But unbeknownst to them, the mare had supporters. These were people who embraced the darkness and whose loyalty to the mare was rewarded through special healing and such. One night, with the assistance of their supporters, the mare snuck onto a boat and sailed away from Scandinavia, never to return. Meanwhile, the followers stayed behind, hoping to convert more followers and one day reunite with the mare. Years went by, and the mare loyalists remained small in number. They married amongst each other, and following the Norman conquest, settled in what eventually became known as Mundyville, Normandy. Several generations passed, and the belief in the mare began to fade. But one family remained persistent in their faith. This family eventually moved to England and adopted the surname Mundy. In 1587, the Mundys sailed from England to North Carolina and joined the infamous Roanoke colony. Hundreds of years prior, the mare had landed in Canada and traveled south along the eastern coastline before they too settled in the Carolinas. But Scandinavia was not the only place in the world in which folktale rang true. There was something more terrifying lurking in the wilds of North America: the Wendigo. This was a creature the natives feared immensely. It was a giant, human-like monstrosity that feasted on people. But it also had an evil air about it, and that energy was a virus to those who were around it too long. It would drive people to commit horrible sins: greed, cannibalism, murder. The Wendigo had a lifespan far longer than the mare, or at least the actual human part of the mare. Evil attracts evil, I reckon, and as a result, the two found each other and merged. The mare possessed the Wendigo, making the beast more nightmarish than it already was. The evil quantities of both remained alive in this one creature. The Mundys were still firm believers in the mare, but practiced their worship in secrecy. There was no question in their minds that the mare existed. They'd always seen the extra shadows following their own. And in North Carolina, they were reunited. The colonists were asleep when the mare arrived in their Wendigo skin, creeping through the night and bringing an extra chill to the air. The Mundys felt the presence of their masters and woke before everyone else. For the others, intense nightmares shook them out of bed. One fella had gotten so terrified, he nearly wet himself. He quickly stumbled outside to relieve his bladder, and while doing so, saw the Mundys knelt by the woods, staring towards the trees. They looked as if they were praising the woods itself. Then all of a sudden, a tree moved. But it wasn't a tree. As the colonist's eyes adjusted, he could see, coming out of the woods, the 15-foot Wendigo, with her gangly limbs and saucer eyes. He tried to warn the others, but it was ultimately useless. The Roanoke colonists were taken to the mountain, leaving behind the mystery of the lost colony that still stumps historians even today. I imagine the folks studying it ain't ever considered that ungodly scenario. The past up to that point was now ingrained in my memory, but there was more. The plans for the future. To cast the world into the chaos of the Wendigo and create an eternal nightmare. They're in the mountains, not just here in Appalachia, but across the entire world. And it's in this mountain that it begins. This is where the mare creates more mare. They're out there already, living amongst y'all, convincing the morally corrupt to follow them. And when the time comes, they will go to the mountains, where the Wendigo wait with an insatiable hunger. When I snapped back to reality, I could see that the Wendigo was hunched over again, eating another meal. I carefully crept out of the lair and back out the way I came in. Sarah was waiting for me. Her face showed that same emotionless expression. "Now you know," she said. "Why am I still alive?" "You're protected." "That ain't what my dad says." "He's not protected." "Then why the hell am I?" Sarah's face changed. The first sign of emotion I'd seen on her yet. She was smirking. "You're a Mundy." I ain't one of you." "Not by name," began Sarah, "but you are by blood." "How?" Sarah didn't seem interested in going into detail. She stared at me a moment through her cloudy old eyes and then reluctantly explained. She told me that long ago, when she was still young, she had a sister named Charlotte who had gotten it in her head that she wanted off the mountain. She wasn't like the rest of the Mundys. She lacked the darkness they had in them. In 1888, Charlotte gave birth to a daughter. It wasn't a planned pregnancy, on account that she wasn't married, but she loved the child regardless. This baby wasn't the product of incest either. Charlotte wasn't into that kind of thing. Now, I'd heard stories of the Mundy sister that got killed by a jealous lover, but what I'd come to find out from Sarah is a truth much more disturbing. In 1889, Charlotte decided she'd had enough. She was going to take her daughter and flee the mountain. But there's a catch. Mundys still have to pay the fee to leave. It's the only time Mundys ever have to pay a fee. Because of their close relationship with the mayor, they are given special treatment. But they are still bound by their promise to serve. For a Mundy, the price to leave is 2 of their children, no exceptions. Charlotte chose not to obey that command, and as a result, it was not a jealous lover that murdered her. It was her siblings. Their loyalty to the mayor superseded whatever they had for their sister. The father of Charlotte's child wasn't present that first year of her life. Maybe he was frightened by the fact that his child was a Mundy, but whatever the case, he had a change of heart after Charlotte's death. He'd gone up to the Mundy house one day with an orphan. A trade. The orphan for his daughter. Now, the Mundys weren't planning on harming Charlotte's child. After all, Mundy blood is protected, assuming you obey the rules. But they recognized that the father has a right to his child. They accepted the trade. I ain't sure what happened to the orphan. Fast forward 20 years and Charlotte's daughter has a child of her own. A boy. They live a mostly quiet life, and in 1935, the boy becomes a father. His child is my grandfather. Almost 30 years later, my mother was born. "Does my mom know?" I asked. Sarah began walking away. "You'll have to ask her." She was heading back towards the way we came in, so I went ahead and followed her. We passed cage after cage, body after body. It seemed the state of mind of these prisoners was so bad, they'd even been killing each other. "My dad's coming with me," I hollered up ahead to Sarah. She did not respond. "You hear me?" I said. I paused. We were near the cage my dad had been locked in. He was no longer in it. My stomach dropped. I quickly ran to the wagon near the stone table I'd seen the prisoner get beheaded earlier. His executioners were still there. I looked at the pile of naked, headless corpses. My heart racing. "Please, don't be in there," I thought. "Please." My dad had gotten a tattoo when I was a kid. It was a small one on his upper arm. Most people didn't know he had it. It was our last name. We often joked that he got it in case he forgot who he was. One of them bodies had that tattoo. There was no mistaking who it was. Them animals had cut off his head and thrown him in the wagon with the others, ready to be served up as a meal to the Wendigo. I'd known that what my dad slipped into my pocket earlier was a knife. I could tell by the size and weight. He'd hid it in his boot before we left the house. It wasn't much, just a regular old pocket knife. But it was enough. I didn't feel the unshackled's fingernails digging into my neck as I stabbed him repeatedly. I didn't feel my finger break as he tried to push my hand away. All I felt was rage. Blinding rage. They must have known I was a Mundy because ain't one of them tried to pick up that axe they had been cutting off heads with. I guess because of who I was, they didn't want to kill me. But I didn't care. They'd killed the man I loved most in this world, and that was unforgivable. Stabbings ain't like you see in the movies. It ain't quick and easy. What happens is they drain out. They bleed to death. When I finished with one, I turned for the other. He'd been the reaper to so many in here. He was likely just another child taken long ago. But he was a man now. He'd grown up in hell. Maybe he was pure once. A light that's been snuffed out. But now, he was just another monster. He'd hesitated, almost made a run for it. But I caught him and did him in like the other. The two unshackled weren't dead when I walked over to the wagon and lifted out my dad's body. One of them stared with wide, fearful eyes, his chest rising and falling. He was growing paler, and I reckon he didn't have long until he bled out. I lifted my dad's body from the pile and set him down, and then I grabbed the dying unshackled and dragged him to the wagon and dumped him in it. The other one gripped my wrist as I dragged him. He was too weak to do anything at that point. I pulled his hands off me and dropped him onto the pile. The Wendigo can eat them fuckers. A key had fallen out of the pocket of one. I reached down and picked it up. I stumbled over to the cage and unlocked it. "Move," I said to the prisoners. They parted, and I saw my dad's head sitting in the dirt. I began to feel pain. Not from the injuries I'd gotten in the fight, but in my chest. A broken heart, I suppose. My arms trembled as I picked up his head. I turned to leave, and huddled by the gate were the Keller boys. They'd been through a lot. I could see it on their faces. Hell, I'm sure they saw it on mine too. They didn't speak. Maybe I looked like another nightmare at that moment. I walked out that gate with my teeth gritted. The shackled prisoner that'd been strapping people down rattled over and locked the cage back up. Still loyal even though he was chained. Sarah never said anything throughout. Never sent Bubba or anyone else to stop me. She just stood there without emotion. "He ain't staying down here," I said. Sarah told Bubba to grab the body. "No!" I pushed Bubba out of the way. "You don't touch him." Dad's backpack was nearby, and I placed his head inside. I put his body over my shoulder, and I carried all of him as I climbed back to the surface. It wasn't easy. It took quite a bit longer going up than it did coming down. But at least he ain't in that hell anymore. I finished burying him after sunrise. One day I'll find him a better place to rest, a place where clear skies and singing birds ain't so misleading. I went inside and washed the blood off my face. The cuts on my face and neck stung. My finger was broken, and I did what I could to fix it. I took a moment to catch my breath. Then I called my mom. Hey there, bud. It wasn't my mom's voice on the other end. It was her brother. Uncle Billy? Your mom is okay. She called me from the church and told me what was going on. Said she still saw the shadow. So I went and got her and brought her back to my place. She's been up all night worrying about you and your daddy. I've always been close to my Uncle Billy. He's a hard-working man who taught me a lot of handy skills I'd been able to utilize in most of my jobs. Knowing that he paid the fee sours the admiration a bit, but so did everyone else. There ain't any saints out here. The best you can hope for is a remorseful sinner. Y'all okay? He added. I need to talk to my mom. I ain't gonna wake her right now. She needs to rest. Come on over. You can talk to her when she wakes up. I just learned that my mom and I are Mondays, so Uncle Billy had to be a Monday too. I'd figured maybe talking to the two of them would increase my chances of receiving an honest answer, so I hopped in my truck and headed to his house. When he answered the door, he saw the marks from the scuffle earlier that morning. Boy, what the hell happened in there? And where's your daddy? I couldn't hold it in anymore. I broke down in tears. My uncle took me in his arms, and I told him what had happened to my dad. He led me inside and had his wife fix me a cold drink. I sat on the sofa and told him the rest of the story. Then I told him what I had learned. I figured I'd try to get the truth out of him first. Sarah said Mom's a Monday. Uncle Billy sat up straight in his seat and inhaled like he'd been figured out. Well, I reckon there ain't no point in lying, he said. We didn't know about us being Mondays when we was kids. Hell, I bet your mama still don't know. This was a major relief to me if true. I hated the thought of my mom keeping it secret from us all this time. But when I got older and moved into this here house, Uncle Billy continued, I took a kid up to the Monday place to pay the fee. Now, you know I bought this land before marrying, so it was just me at the time. I didn't have any children, so I did what many people do. I bought some kid. I squirmed in my seat a bit. It made me feel uncomfortable hearing about that sick alternative again. But I reckon it's just about the only option for someone who don't have the stomach to give up his own child. Other than suicide. Uncle Billy put out his hands. I know. And for the record, I wouldn't have given away my own child. Uncle Billy turned to his daughter, my cousin Sadie, and winked. She responded with a high-pitched, "Love you, Daddy." That was like nails on a chalkboard. She's kin, but I always found her childlike and annoying. and I was also just discovering that she knew about the fee. I would never have figured she'd be one not to spill the beans. So, anyway, Uncle Billy continued. I spoke to Sarah and told her, I got this here kid. I want to pay my fee and be done with it. And then she told me not to worry. I didn't have to pay a fee. I said, excuse me? She said, Mondays don't pay. Uncle Billy leaned back and chuckled. You can imagine my surprise. A Monday? My word. I ain't ever expected that. I wasn't laughing. There wasn't anything funny about it. I was starting to get an uneasy feeling. What did you do with the kid? I asked. Oh. Uncle Billy held up a hand as he finished taking a sip of his sweet tea. I donated him. The bad feeling had now boiled over. I stood up and crossed over to the closed guest room door and opened it. My mom wasn't inside. Where is she? I was panicking. I'd always trusted Uncle Billy. This seemed so out of character for him. And get this, come to find out later that your aunt here is a Monday too. I married kin. Ain't that funny? Where's my mom? I yelled. Billy. I ain't even gonna call him uncle anymore. Came over and blocked me in the hallway. You know, a loyal Monday can become a mayor, right? You prove your worth, and they'll give you a promotion. Pass on their abilities. Billy grinned. My girls and I, we gonna be mayors. Ain't we, girls? His wife, Georgia, and Sadie were standing behind him. Georgia was rubbing his arm up and down, keeping her glare on me the whole time. You tell me where she is, damn it! My fists were closed tight. I'd been through hell, and my patience had worn thin. She's alive, but if you want to see her, you're gonna have to do us a favor. I had no interest in doing any favors for these shitbags, but I reluctantly listened for my mom's sake. I need you to go and find your daddy's mama and bring her to me. She's dead. I ain't talking about that woman who raised him. I mean his real mama. The one with native blood. I don't know where she is. I ain't ever even met her. Which was true. She left when my dad was a baby. I'd heard stories about her being half Cherokee and crazy as all get out. I was told we were better off without her in our life. Well, you better go find her, said Billy. Why do you want her? That grandmother of yours is the only one that ever got away without paying the fee. The mayor would be awfully happy to have her back. Finding my grandmother wasn't easy. I didn't have a lot of people I could ask. My dad has several siblings, but he was the oldest and the only one with a different mother. My grandfather ain't alive anymore, so I couldn't go to him. The only option I could think of was to ask other Cherokee Indians if they'd any idea where she was. So I left the mountain in search of her. Now, we can leave the mountain temporarily. As I said before, we'd been on vacations, but there's that extra shadow. I ain't ever noticed it until now because I was just a kid before. I had no interest in my shadow. But sure enough, once I left town, there it was, A shadow ain't always present, of course. At least not that you can see. But if the light hits you just right, you'll see it. I'd driven up to Cherokee. It might sound a bit too obvious that Cherokee live in Cherokee, but it's a small town on reservation land. There's a sort of stereotype that natives are wise. Like they sit around wearing feathers and smoking a peace pipe, sharing allegorical tales that'll set you right better than any doctor ever could. But the truth is that they're flawed people like the rest of us. Although maybe not as bad as the folks on the mountain. However, some ain't strayed from who they are. They stuck to tradition and ain't let the modern world muddy their minds. My grandmother's name is Liza. I at least knew that. Her father was Cherokee, and her mother was some sort of European, I guess. I didn't have much to go off. I'd asked maybe 100 natives if they knew her. Most didn't. Some saw my extra shadow and beat feet. But I'd finally stumbled upon a man who did. He was older, probably close to her age. He looked like a traditionalist based on how he was dressed and looked. He was sitting on a park bench. He spoke to me first, asked me if I lived on my own. I reckon that would be an odd way to start a conversation if you didn't know the truth about the mountain. No, I live with my parents, I said. I know Dad ain't alive anymore, but excluding him from the household don't feel right yet. I know a woman who can get rid of that extra shadow. Sounds like the lady I'm looking for. What's her name? Liza. He showed me on a map where she was located. She was outside of town, living in the woods in some old house. He told me to be careful, that she wasn't too fond of unexpected visitors. I thanked him and started heading back to my truck. Tell your grandmother I said hello. I turned around to ask him how he knew who I was, and he'd already started walking off in the other direction. I still ain't sure how he knew. The woods were thick, and I'd almost missed the road to her house. It was a narrow dirt road that ran off a separate dirt road. It was long and winding, and I didn't see any signs or a mailbox on my way up. I finally pulled up to a single-story cabin with a large front porch. Smoke was coming out of the chimney. I got out of the truck quietly. I didn't slam the door on the old Ford like I usually do. Then I felt something jab into my upper back. Don't move. It was a man's voice. He had a gun on me. I raised my arms above my head. I don't mean no trouble, I said. I'm looking for Liza. He pushed the gun harder into my back. What's your business with Liza? He asked. Suddenly the cabin door opened and an older woman stepped onto the porch. She wasn't hunched over and frail like Sarah. She looked younger and much healthier. Her hair was long but tied up, and she had native jewelry on. But her clothes were regular, a western shirt and jeans. Let him go. The man eased the barrel off my back. Can I help you? The woman asked. You Liza? I am. I'm your grandson. She was a bit hesitant at first, but Liza soon recognized features on my face that she remembered from my grandfather's. She invited me inside. This is Diwali, she said, introducing me to a native man who had been holding the gun on me. He's a cousin. Diwali nodded. He appeared to be a little older than me and looked like a Cherokee warrior in modern clothes. He had a braided mohawk and tribal tattoos on his arms. He was lean but looked powerful, the type you didn't want to hold eye contact with too long. I reckon Diwali means warrior or something cool like that, huh? I asked. It means bull, Diwali replied, straight-faced. Oh, neat. We call him Wally, Liza added. And what did your daddy name you? I think my mom and him figured it out together. Mason. That's the name of a stone worker. Well, I didn't pick it. I suppose it's better than Bull. Sorry, Wally. Wally shrugged and continued carving on a piece of wood with a pocket knife. So, how is your father? Liza asked. I looked at the floor, trying to summon up the strength to say just 2 words. He's dead. Liza didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, looking disappointed more than pained. How'd he die? She finally asked. He got killed inside the mountain. I'm sorry. It was strange, his mother apologizing to me. But I reckon she never really knew him. I hear you can get rid of this extra shadow, I said, trying to change the subject. It's already gone. What? Walk over to that lamp. Look for yourself. I got up and waved my hand over the lamp. Only one shadow. My own. How'd you get rid of it? Liza pointed to the various dream catchers hanging around the house. I thought those were just decorations, I said. The ones you buy in some gift shop might be. They're not blessed. They often aren't even made with tribal hands. But these are genuine. But why do they get rid of the shadows? Dream catchers were made to protect people from nightmares. The mayor? Liza nodded. Yep. So is the shadow gone completely? Am I free? The dream catchers don't catch anything, despite what the name would have you believe. They're more of a repellent. Then what do I do when I leave? Liza reached into a drawer and handed me a leather string with a small dream catcher hanging from it. Wear this around your neck, she said. I put it on and couldn't help but grin. It's that easy? Liza leaned back in her seat and crossed her legs. Anything else? I took a deep breath and decided to come clean. My mom's brother wants to become a mayor. He's taken my mom and said he won't let me see her unless I bring you to him. Wally stopped carving the wood and turned his focus to the conversation. So, he wants to give me to the mayor? Asked Liza. I nodded. Liza leaned forward. Then let's pay him a visit. The straight-faced Willie looked to her and gave the faintest of smiles. Liza had sent Willie to prepare and pulled me aside. Mason, what all do you know? About what? You only know about the mayor and the Wendigo? Well, I also know I'm a Mundy. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the others. What others? I suppose you don't have the others on your mountain. At least not yet. What others? Liza looked me in the eyes. This country used to be mostly empty land. You know that, right? I nodded. People came in and built cities. kept making them bigger and bigger. And what had previously roamed the land became confined to less and less space. Sounds like you're describing animals. Liza smiled. Well, them too. But I'm talking about the creatures of old. What creatures? You've heard about them. These are the legends of folklore, Mason. All those tales that you thought were just campfire stories, they're all true. They stay well hidden. But they're out there. And they want the land back. We were on the road heading to Billy's house. My truck was only a 2-seater, so Liza and I sat up front and Wally in the bed. He'd brought a rifle and a tomahawk. It was one of them tactical ones, not native style like you might expect. I also had one of my dad's old rifles hanging up in the back of the cab and a revolver in the glove box. We had a bit of a ride, so I figured I'd get something off my chest. Why'd you leave the mountain? I asked. Wouldn't you like to? Well, yeah, but why'd you leave my dad behind? Liza sat quietly for a moment, watching the trees go by out the window. I was only 17 when I had him. I wasn't ready to be a mother. I wasn't ready for a lot of things. But the idea of raising a child on that mountain was too much. I told your grandfather that I wanted to leave and I wanted them to come with me, but his parents held too much sway over him, convinced him that there was no other place to go. That don't make any sense. You knew how to get away without paying the fee. Why would they want y'all to stay? I don't know. I guess they'd fallen under the Mundy spell. Worshipped them like so many others. It was sickening. I tried to take your dad with me, but his grandparents stopped me. Said they'd kill me if I tried taking him away. So, I left. That must have been hard. It was at first, but I checked on him periodically. Made sure he was being raised right. You came back to the mountain? Yep. I never stayed long. Just long enough to see your dad was all right. Nobody ever saw me. When did you stop checking on him? When he moved out of your grandfather's house. I hated knowing that he paid that horrible fee to live on his own. Why didn't you tell him about the dream catchers? He could have left and never had to pay that damn fee. Well, I guess I figured he wouldn't want to leave, like his father. Well, he wasn't like his father. Paying that fee broke his heart. Liza fell quiet again and went back to looking out the window. We drove on in silence the rest of the way and eventually came upon Billy's driveway. The house was hidden a little ways back in the woods. This is it, I said. Liza tapped on the rear window, and Wally jumped out at the end of the driveway. He took his rifle and tomahawk and disappeared into the woods. We rolled down the driveway and got out of the truck. Billy met us out front with a shotgun in hand. Well, well, he began. You found the old hag. Georgia and Sadie came out on the porch behind him and stood by the door with their arms crossed and arrogant looks on their faces. Yeah, I got her. Where's my mom? Slow down there, Mason. Bring your grandmammy on up here first. I looked over at Liza and nodded for her to go ahead of me. We tied her wrists to make the whole thing look more convincing. That's it, said Billy as we got closer. I want to get a good look at the one who got away. Suddenly, there was a wet thump behind Billy and a spray of blood off to his side. Sadie's eyes got real big as she let out a petrified wail. Billy turned around. Georgia? Wally had stuck his tomahawk into the top of Georgia's head and then quickly reached over and grabbed Sadie. Wally put his boot up against Georgia's back and pulled the tomahawk out of her head. There was a sound like splitting wood as it came out. He pushed her away, and Billy watched in awe as her lifeless body fell at his feet. You killed my Georgia, Billy said, sounding like a man who'd just lost his soul. And I'll kill your daughter next if you don't tell us what we want to know, Liza said. She was untied, although she was never tied tightly to begin with. Billy seemed to be in shock as he turned back to us. He was pale as a ghost. Drop that gun, I told him, and aimed my revolver at his chest. He didn't hesitate. He put it down and raised his hands. I ain't even sure that gun was loaded, to be honest. Let Sadie go, he begged. She ain't done nothing. Wally pressed the tomahawk blade more firmly against Sadie's throat. She was trembling like a leaf. Tears were flowing down her cheeks. We'll be the judge of that, said Liza. Now tell us where your sister is. I gave her to the Mundys. You what? Liza sounded surprised. She reached out and grabbed the revolver from my hand as Billy started pleading again. Please, let's say... Billy's words were cut short as Liza fired a round into his forehead. He dropped like a sack of potatoes. Sadie started to scream, but Wally cut that short too. I stood at the end of the porch looking at my dead relatives. I loved them once. It's a tough pill to swallow, knowing that maybe they never really cared about me. But as I looked at them fuckers laying lifeless on that porch, I realized that I couldn't care less. They got what was coming to them. Wally had gone over to the truck bed and grabbed a canister of gasoline and started dumping it all over the bodies in the house. Get in the truck, Liza said to me. We walked over to the truck and got in. Wally tossed a lit match and sent the house up in flames, then jumped back into the truck bed. What now? I asked. We need to hurry and get to the Mundy house. They ain't gonna hurt her. She's a Mundy. We're protected. Nobody's protected, Mason. They lied to you. Now get moving. We'd driven up to the start of my road. In the distance, black smoke from Billy's burning house was building above the tree line. Liza told me to pull the truck off to the side behind some trees. Then we climbed out, and she told Wally to go scout up top and that we'd wait for him in the woods on the other side of the road. Wally grabbed his tomahawk and took off through the woods and up the mountain. I reckon he didn't want nothing slowing him down because he took the scope and left his rifle behind with Liza. I took my dad's rifle out from behind the seats, and we headed off across the road. We went a few feet back and crouched behind some trees. The smoke was still building. We figured it was only a matter of time before we'd be hearing the volunteers racing on with their sirens wailing. "How do you know so much?" I asked Liza. "About what?" "Everything. The Mundys, the mayor." Liza was quiet for a moment as she looked out to the road. "I had an older brother," she began. "He was a half-brother. We had different fathers. When he was 8 and I was 3, my mother gave him to the Mundys." She paused. I could tell her mind was searching some distant memory. 12 years later, he returned. For a while, he didn't talk. He barely even moved. But one day, he woke up and told me everything. "Like what?" "Well, I'm sure you saw a lot of it yourself. The cages, the cannibalism, the executions, the Wendigo. But he also told me about the Mundys and how they would kill each other, especially if they got a sense that a certain Mundy's loyalty was waning. That's why we need to hurry up and get my mom." "Yup." "Do Mundys really not have to pay the fee?" "Yeah, that part is true. If you're a Mundy, it's free to live here. It costs 2 of your own blood to leave." "Why is that?" "To convince you to stay, I guess." "You said nobody is protected. Even other families that give up their own children?" Liza turned to look at me. She seemed frustrated. "Mason, never trust the word of evil. Everything they say and do is for their own benefit. They promise protection so that those people become more loyal to them, but the Mundys are only loyal to the mayor. If they decide that somebody they promise protection to needs to die, then they won't hesitate to kill them." It seemed so obvious now that I'd heard it. I guess it's just human nature to trust someone. Just because police enforce the laws, it don't mean they won't break them. Athletes cheat despite there being rules. Married couples have affairs even though they vowed to be faithful. Some of it's broken word. Some of it's hypocrisy. But if you ask me, hypocrisy is just the breaking of an unspoken promise. A promise ain't nothing but a moment you can look back on and realize you'd been fooled. "What happened to your brother?" I asked. Liza turned her gaze back to the road. "He killed himself soon after." Wally came creeping up about 20 minutes later. Said he'd seen an old lady, 3 deformed fellas, 2 of the ugliest women he'd ever laid eyes on, and a man in a police uniform. But no sign of my mom. "Well, I guess Chief Collins is up there," I said. "He'll be armed." Liza looked over to Wally. "And you take him out first." Wally nodded. Liza turned back to me. "Mason, you and I are going to drive your truck up there. We're going to talk to them first. They want me, so we'll act as if I'm giving myself up. When I give the signal, Wally takes out Collins and whichever of those inbred fuckers he can. Mason, you're going to grab the rifle from the truck, so make sure it's somewhere you can grab it quickly. I'll have my revolver on me." "The Mundys can take a lot of damage. Dad shot one several times, and the fucker never died." "They can die. Just make sure to aim for their heads." Liza stood up and told Wally to head back up the mountain and find a spot. Then, she stopped him. "Oh, and one more thing. Leave the old lady alive." The sun was setting as we pulled up to the Mundy property. In the distance, we could finally hear the sirens heading towards the fire. All the Mundys, and Collins with his pistol in hand, came outside. Liza and I got out of the truck. "I reckon y'all are the ones that caused the fire over yonder?" said Collins. "Yep," said Liza. Collins looked over at me. "I had a feeling that dumbass uncle of yours would fuck up." "He got what was coming to him," I said. "I suppose you think we'll get ours too?" I gritted my teeth and didn't respond. I so badly wanted to shoot him right then. "I'm turning myself in," said Liza. "Me for his mother." Collins laughed. "You expect us to believe that? I mean, look!" He pointed at the black plume of smoke off in the distance. "That ain't the doings of a woman planning to give herself up." "I did that," I interrupted. "I trusted Billy, and he betrayed me. I was angry." Collins looked over at me and began playing with his mustache. "Fine. Liza, stand there and let me search you for weapons." "Where's his mother?" Collins stopped. "You gonna let me search you first?" "Show us his mother." Collins turned and looked at Sarah and chuckled. "I told you, didn't I?" He quickly swung back around with his pistol aimed at the ready. I heard the shot before I saw the impact. A distant rifle had opened up Collins' head. He hit the ground, dead as a doornail. Sarah's eyes darted to our dead kin and then back to me. She let out the soul-piercing scream, an order to attack. Liza had pulled the revolver that had been tucked behind her lower back and was firing shots at the charging Mundys. I could hear the echo of Wally's rifle in the distance as I dove into the truck to grab mine. I swung around, and the younger Mundy was nearly on me. Suddenly, his head snapped to the side, and he went down. I quickly looked over to my right, and I could see the glint from Wally's rifle in a tree atop the mountain's highest point. Liza had ducked back into the truck to reload, but we weren't dealing with other shooters, so cover didn't matter. 3 of the Mundys were already dead, the younger one and the 2 women, as well as Collins. Bubba and the other male Mundy were still alive. Sarah was still screaming. She'd occasionally stop to take a breath and then keep going. It was a loud scream. Louder than you'd expect from an old woman. But it wasn't inhuman. I suppose it was her way of communicating with them inbreds. The 2 remaining Mundys were charging us. Bubba was sprinting at me and the other at Liza, who was still busy loading the revolver. I turned and fired at the Mundy charging her. The first shot hit him in the chest and barely slowed him down. Then the second one hit his head. He fell to the dirt and slid to a stop. A second later, Bubba collided with me. He was on top of me, but instead of trying to hold me down like last time, he was like a rabid animal trying to tear me to shreds. I had the rifle along my chest, trying to keep him off of me. He was making incoherent noises and salivating. I was pushing with every bit of strength I had in me, but he was stronger. Sarah was still screaming. Then suddenly she stopped and yelled, "Bubba!" with genuine panic in her voice. A shot exploded into his head, raining blood and matter as he fell limp on top of me. Liza had gotten him point blank with the revolver. Sarah was now crying with anguish. I pushed Bubba off me, and Liza helped me to my feet. We'd crossed over to Sarah, who was now more emotional than I'd thought possible. "Where's my mom?" "Kill me," Sarah replied. "We'll do worse than that," said Liza. "Now tell us where she is." Sarah didn't respond. She just sat there sobbing. Wally appeared out of the woods and joined us. "Make her speak, Wally," said Liza. He hung his rifle over his shoulder and pulled out his tomahawk. He grabbed Sarah by her long, greasy hair. She flailed around, screaming for him to let her go. He threw her back to the ground, stepped on her arm, and without hesitation, cut off her hand. She cried out in agony. "Where is she?" he calmly asked. Sarah kept crying. He put his boot on her other arm and brought the tomahawk's blade down on her wrist, severing her remaining hand. Sarah cried out louder, but still didn't say anything. Wally stepped back and pressed onto her leg. Her face was panic-stricken as she watched. He gave her a moment to speak, and then lifted his tomahawk. "She's with the mare!" she finally confessed. Wally relaxed. Liza moved up to her. "Is she alive?" Sarah's crying began to morph into laughter. Wally brought the tomahawk down onto her ankle. Her laughter returned to wailing again, but only for a moment. She was back to laughing. "Yum yum," she said with a panicked chuckle. She was rubbing her belly with her bloody nubs. "Tasty mommy." She kept laughing. Wally and Liza glanced at each other with concern. I couldn't stand it anymore. I stepped past Wally, put the rifle to Sarah's head, and silenced her laughter for good. I went into the house and over to the padlocked door. Liza followed after me. "Mason, wait. Don't go in there yet." I brought the butt of the rifle down on the padlock a couple of times and broke it off. "Mason!" I stepped through the door and began descending into the cavern. I rushed down the long, spiraling stairway. I ain't claiming what I did was smart. It certainly was not that. There wasn't any thinking involved, to be honest. I'd lost everyone I cared about, and I had reason to believe my mom was next. She was the last person I had to hold on to. The last person I had to live for. So at that moment, I figured either I'd save her or I'd die. The way I see it, those were the only two options. Liza and Wally were scrambling after me, trying to convince me to turn around. I told them to head back up, that I'd do it on my own. They, of course, did not listen. I suppose they thought I was running towards my death. But what we found once we reached the bottom was entirely unexpected. It was empty. The cages that had previously held hundreds of prisoners were now completely vacant. The cage doors hung open. Chains lay spread across the dirt. "Where is everybody?" I said, primarily to myself. "Mason, this isn't good. We need to go back up," said Liza. I ignored her and headed towards the back of the cave. They reluctantly followed. At the end, I came upon the opening to the Wendigo's lair. I could once again sense the evil waiting beyond the jagged tunnel. I stepped inside. It was dark. The chandelier above wasn't lit. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I carefully crept forward. Then I bumped into something. A person. I took a step back, and the chandelier suddenly lit up overhead. I could now see under the dim light that the room was packed. Every single prisoner was standing in there with me, and they were all facing my direction. "Welcome back, Mason," they all said simultaneously, reverberating through the cavern like a cathedral. The candles along the cavern walls were sparking to life and pulsating with each word, and then fell back into darkness when they were silent. "Thank you for bringing us your grandmother," they said, the lights once again pulsating. I turned around to see Liza and Wally standing at my back. Wally was white-knuckle gripping his tomahawk. I returned my attention to the crowd. "Where's my mom?" "You're too late." The room returned to near darkness, the chandelier providing only minimal light. My heart sank. "What do you mean? Where is she?" From the middle of the crowd, I watched a large, dark figure rise. The Wendigo stood at her full height. I could barely make out 2 human legs dripping with blood, dangling from the beast's mouth. The Wendigo bit down, severing the legs, and then gave a large, bone-chilling grin as she swallowed the remainder of the body. I yelled, something primal and reactionary. A sound deep in me that only the most significant emotional anguish could bring out. And the Wendigo yelled back. The flames from the candles surged to a blinding brightness as the Wendigo's singular roar shook the cavern walls. I tried to maintain my balance as the ground vibrated. Then she stopped, and calmly said through the chorus of voices I'd heard the first time I'd been in the cavern, "Bring them to me." The entire crowd charged us at once. We turned and ran. We squeezed through the narrow tunnel, scuffing against the rocky walls as we spilled out into the main cavern. The crowd of possessed prisoners were pouring out the same tunnel, climbing across one another. Men, women, children. They all seemed physically equal despite their differences. Wally and I tried to pull Liza along, but she was slower than us. I looked back at the charging horde. They were nearly on us. I said a quiet apology, and then I braced for impact. But nothing happened. I opened my eyes. We were surrounded. The crowd watched us with hunger still present in their eyes. They wanted to attack us, but for some reason, they couldn't. The three of us slowly stood to our feet, baffled by what we were seeing. "What the hell is this?" asked Wally. Liza thought for a moment and then removed the dream catcher from around her neck. She held it out in front of her. The prisoners recoiled. "The mayor can't get past the dream catchers, and they can't get the prisoners to attack us without possessing them." Liza seemed to be realizing this for the first time. She began walking towards the crowd, Dreamcatcher held out in front of her. The prisoners spread apart, creating a path to the exit. "Let's go," said Liza. We started to follow her. Then we heard a roar coming from the end of the cave and the sound of breaking bones. The Wendigo's arm appeared outside the tunnel, followed by her face, which had become morphed and broken. Another arm shot out the opening as the Wendigo pulled herself through. More snapping bones, the Wendigo's body jolting with each snap. The Wendigo was violently contorting her body to get through the narrow tunnel. She was dragging herself out. Her long, gangly body slid against the dirt. Once outside, her body immediately started repairing itself, joints and bones popping back into place. She turned and stared at us, with her large saucer eyes. Liza's voice trembled as she uttered, "She's no longer possessed by the mayor." It's been over a week since I first stepped foot in that cave. I ain't the same man I was before I went in. Sometimes I sit for hours just looking at nothing, thinking about nothing. Like my mind is afraid of what's behind the curtain. I can't say I've relaxed since then, but I ain't had any nightmares. Before all this happened, I would have expected an experience like this would plague a man with terrible visions each night. Something that would wake him up out of bed, drenched in sweat and his heart pounding. Don't get me wrong, there are certainly nights I don't get any rest, more than not. But as I've come to learn it, there ain't any nightmares without the mayor. It's how you know they're near. And that goes for everyone, not just the folks on the mountain. The Wendigo plays a different role. The Wendigo corrupts the human soul. You find yourself in a place where some of the worst sins you can imagine run rampant, then there's a good chance a Wendigo is nearby. You might smell the decay or feel the evil in the air. The mayor and the Wendigo, a match made in hell. See, the mayor don't typically go beyond nightmares. They make your soul tremble, and yeah, sometimes it's too much for a person's heart to handle. But they ain't possessing someone that ain't already deeply corrupted, which is what the Wendigo did to them prisoners. The Wendigo opens the door for the mayor to enter. "Run," Liza said quietly as if it slipped out of her mouth. The Wendigo was moving towards us, her body twisting and jumping every which way as it popped and cracked back into place. We took off for the stairs, our dream catchers held in front of us. The prisoners stood wild-eyed and jittery, like a horde of zombies unable to move. Our feet hit the stone steps, and we hung our dream catchers back around our necks. We were taking 2 to 3 steps at a time, trying to get to the top as quickly as possible. Liza's age was a factor, slowing her down quite a bit. Wally ditched his rifle and had her get onto his back. He's strong and quick, and he could manage to carry her better than I'm sure I could. The prisoners were pursuing us, but they couldn't get close enough to do any harm while we had the dream catchers on us. But the roar of that Wendigo was growing closer, and she certainly could harm us. Something was hitting the walls heavily, shaking the stairway carved from the mountain itself. I turned to look real quick, and there she was. She was twisting and contorting around the bend, bones breaking and snapping back into place. Prisoners were crawling across her and below her, anywhere they could get through. Some of them would make it out in front of her and then immediately get trampled or swatted out of the way. I still had my rifle on me, and I turned and I fired, but it did nothing to slow her down. Wally was well in front of me, despite Liza being on his back. I could tell she wasn't the type that liked to be carried around, but she knew her limits. She had her head turned throughout, hollering at me to hurry up. At one point, the Wendigo swiped at me and nearly hit me with its arm-length fingers, and that gave me the extra boost of adrenaline I needed to catch up to Wally. I could see the exit up ahead. We were nearly there. The Wendigo was still behind us, sounding louder and angrier. We reached the door and spilled into the interior of the Mundy house. I ain't sure why I figured it would work, but I immediately jumped back up to seal the door shut. The Wendigo hit it like a speeding train, launching me backward and out one of the previously boarded up windows. The air left my lungs as I hit the ground outside. I laid out there dazed and struggling to breathe beneath the night sky. I'm sure I was hurting, but I didn't have time to acknowledge it. Wally and Liza were outside helping me to my feet. "Get up, Mason. We have to get to the truck," said Liza. "Where's the Wendigo?" "She's in the..." At that moment, the Wendigo came crashing through the decrepit old wall and launched herself at us. We ducked back down to the dirt and watched as she overshot us and tumbled down the backside of the mountain. "This ain't gonna slow her down for long. Let's go," said Liza. We ran back through the house. The prisoners were pouring out of the door but still stopping before they could touch us. We ran past Sarah's body and reached the front entrance, and exited into the yard. The truck was still there, along with all the other dead Mundys. I tossed Wally my rifle and jumped behind the wheel. Liza got in next to me. The prisoners were pouring out of every opening of the house. I started the truck and spun the tires, kicking up dirt and rock, as I turned the truck around and started heading down the mountain. "Here she comes!" shouted Wally. I looked in the mirror and could see that the Wendigo had made it back up the mountain. "What do we do?" I asked Liza. "We need fire." "Why?" "The Wendigo is weak to fire." "What about the mare?" "Take out the Wendigo, and the prisoners will no longer be corrupted. They won't be suitable vessels for the mare." I rechecked the mirror. The Wendigo was fast, but my truck was a little bit faster. "Okay," I said. "When we get to the bottom of the mountain, you and Wally need to get out. We need the Wendigo to come after you." "Mason, what are you doing?" "I'm going to take the truck back up the mountain. I need you two to keep the Wendigo at the bottom." I skidded to a stop at the bottom and got out of the truck. The Wendigo was still a little ways off. "Wally, how much gas you got left in that jug?" Wally picked up the jug and shook it. "About a cup." "You still have those matches?" He nodded. I asked him to give me a couple of matches and then took off my jacket and handed it to him. "Wrap your tomahawk blade with this and pour some gas on it." He jumped out of the truck and did as I asked. "When that Wendigo is getting close, you light that up and keep her at bay." Wally nodded. I got back behind the wheel and spun the truck around. "And Wally," I said before leaving, "take care of my grandma." I smiled at the two of them and sped up the mountain. I'd only known them a day, but the way I saw it, they were the only kin I still had. The Wendigo was charging down the mountain as I was racing back up. The road ain't very wide, so I had to swerve into a yard to avoid her. She took a swipe at me and clipped the truck, causing the rear to swing out. I regained control and kept going. I could see in the mirror that she had noticed Wally and Liza at the bottom. She even appeared to hesitate at first, deciding which of us she wanted to go after. She turned and headed down the mountain. I didn't have much time. I sped up a little way and braked hard. I jumped out of the truck with the matches in my dad's old handkerchief. I opened the gas cap, got the cloth wet with some fuel, and stuck it in. I struck a match and lit the handkerchief. I quickly ran back to the truck and jumped in, and turned around down the mountain. I just started picking up some speed when the gas caught fire. The truck bed was quickly engulfed in flames. I accelerated some more and the engine caught fire. Flames were whipping the windshield. The dark smoke was thickening. I could barely see in front of me. There was a crackle and a small explosion as I lost the use of the gas pedal, but I'd already picked up momentum and was heading down the mountain fast. The heat from the fire was becoming unbearable. The smoke and fire flickered just enough that I could see I was almost at the bottom. Wally was swinging the makeshift torch back and forth, keeping the Wendigo from getting any closer to them. The horde of possessed prisoners was stampeding down the mountain behind me. I laid on the horn, now only about a second from the bottom. I opened the door and dived out, landing hard against the dirt road. The blazing Ford collided with the Wendigo right as she turned around. It knocked her down and rolled on top of her, covering her in flames. Her roar was loud and pained. It almost resembled the agonizing wail I'd heard from Sarah earlier. She was flailing around wildly, fire eating away at her pale flesh. Through the flames, I could see her large saucer eyes staring right at me. She was no longer screaming. She wasn't making any sound at all. She just looked at me, as if she'd see me again. I stared right back at her and watched the bitch die. Wally and Liza ran over to me. They tried to help me up, but I told them not to. I could feel I'd broken a few ribs, maybe some other stuff as well. "Look," Wally nodded. The prisoners were standing around, scattered and confused, like they'd just woken up from a bad dream. Against my better judgment, I went ahead and let Wally and Liza get me to my feet and limped over to the crowd. I was looking for the Keller boys. I hollered their names the best I could, but it hurt to speak, let alone yell. I was looking at the hundreds of gaunt, dirty faces. Grown men and women who had been inside the mountain since they were children. And then there were the ones who are still children, who had witnessed the worst horrors imaginable. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to look. It was my mom. I couldn't believe it. I grabbed her and hugged her tight. I couldn't speak. I thought I'd lost her, and there she was. She'd never even been touched by the Wendigo. And at our side stood the Keller boys. I guess the mountain is healed from its sickness now, but the scars remain. The folks that live out there did some awful things that they will have to live with. It ain't worth pretending anymore. So we left. Liza showed me a spot on her property where we could bury my dad. It's a nice spot beneath a maple tree. He'd like it. Mom and the Keller boys are with us at Liza's house. The boys don't yet understand that their parents willingly gave them up, and we don't have the heart to tell them. For now, they'll stay with us until we can get things sorted out. They ain't going back to them rotten parents of theirs, though. Mom says she's had enough of the mountains and has decided she wants to live somewhere flat, like Florida. I can't say I blame her. I told her most parents eventually end up in Florida anyways. Me, though? I think I'll stay here. I was sitting on the front porch, watching the sun go down, and Liza came out and joined me. So, you've decided to stay, she said. For now. Well, I'm happy to hear that. I smiled. Good. You know, Mason. Liza leaned towards me. If you're going to stay, Wally and I were thinking you could help us. With what? Liza leaned back in her chair again. There are others still out there. I know. Wendigo in just about every mountain and mare waiting to join them. Yeah, but the Wendigo aren't the only evil out there opening the doors for the mare. I nodded. Then what should we do? Liza looked over at me and smirked. Close the doors. Hi everyone. As we have wrapped up the kin for my channel, I wanted to take a moment to thank the wonderful author that crafted and created this tale of horror. Fishermantales has been able to portray such an exciting environment for this story, and with good reason. I've covered other stories from them as well, such as There's Something Wrong with the Deer, Stranded, and Motorhome, just to name a few. They are also quite active over on Reddit, producing many different stories, so if you enjoyed this work and would like to continue reading, head over to the description for this video as you'll be able to find a link to the original post as well as some other goodies. And also, as an added treat, I'm sure many of you, as well as myself, are quite sad that this is the end of the line for Mason here. However, don't be upset. Fishermantales has a continuation of the series on their subreddit that I will also post a link to, so feel free to continue checking in with that story as well as many of the other works they've produced. Again, thank you Fishermantales for allowing me to read such an interesting story on the channel, and I look forward to covering other series entries moving forward. This has been such a wonderful experience for myself as well as the community, I hope, so I look forward to the future with other stories that we cover. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch, and I will see you for the next tale. Take care, and stay safe.